Siona God, hello all. Osh afternoon, good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 3, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And I had to like abruptly end it because, oh my gosh, I only had 4 seconds left. I'm telling you, this book just like draws you in with all the, I don't know, the craziness. Because it's like living in the upside down, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, it just can't be that way, right? Anyway, so it says here, this is Shelby Steele given his account on teaching at a university. So it says, for some years, I have noticed that I can walk into any of my classes on the first day of the semester, identify the Black students, and be sadly confident that on the last day of the semester, a disproportionate number of them will be at the bottom of the class, far behind any number of white students of equal or even lesser ability. Statistical data substantiate these impressions. Black students typically perform academically below the level of those white students with the same mental test scores, in contrast to Asian American students who perform better than white students with the same test scores as themselves. In short, even though Black students average lower test scores than either white or Asian American students, those test scores are not necessarily the rule, nor perhaps even the predominant reason for lower Black academic achievement. Indeed, it is possible that the lower test scores may be a result of cultural attitudes and of actions or inactions over a period of years based on those attitudes, more so than a cause of academic failures. While it has long been known that historically the average IQ of Blacks has been about 85, compared to a national average of 100, what has not been so widely known is that the average IQ of Blacks in the North was for years consistently higher than that of Blacks in the South. A 1942 study of freshmen at Black colleges found, in quotes, the superiority of freshmen from northern schools over those from southern schools was found to persist throughout the colleges, end quote. As already noted, Black soldiers from some northern states scored higher on mental tests than whites from some southern states due to the First World War. From that same era, European immigrants from cultures where education was not a high priority for ordinary people, parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, for example, scored no higher on mental tests than American Blacks. And in some communities, their children scored lower than Northern Black children attending the same schools. The low test scores of some European immigrant children cannot be automatically attributed to their being new to the United States. There have been settled communities of whites with test scores similar to those of Blacks, where these have been culturally isolated people, such as the inhabitants of the Hebrides, Hebrides, islands of Scotland, or people living in Tennessee mountain communities, in parentheses and in quotes, hillbillies, or inhabitants of canal boat communities in Britain. In short, some kinds of cultures tend to produce lower mental test scores, whether the people in those cultures are Black or white, American or European. As someone has aptly said, in quotes, the tests are not unfamiliar. Life is unfair, and the tests measure the results. End quote. No one chooses which culture to be born into or can be blamed for how that culture evolved in centuries past. In business ownership, as in other ways, the pattern among Black Americans has followed the pattern of rednecks in earlier times. Excuse me. With people from other groups owning most of the businesses in Black neighborhoods, some may try to explain the lack of locally owned businesses in the ghettos by racial discrimination or poverty, but as early as the 1920s, there were numerous Black-owned businesses in Harlem. Don't let them tell you that there wasn't. They are successful too, the majority of which were owned by Blacks from the Caribbean, not Blacks from the American South, who were the majority population of Harlem. Although New York was the principal destination of Blacks from the Caribbean, then as now, the 1930 census showed that there were more than 4 times as many native-born Blacks in Manhattan as there were foreign-born Blacks. In a parallel of differences between Southern and non-Southern whites, a study of West Indian Blacks in the United States noted that the Negro, and this is in quotes, the Negro immigrants, particularly the British West Indians, bring a zest of learning that is not typical of the native-born population, end quote. While Black Americans have long been overrepresented among people in prison, a study of the racial composition of New York State's Sing Sing prison in the early 1930s found that Black West Indians were underrepresented relative to their share of the population at a time when native-born Black Americans were overrepresented several-fold among Sing Sing inmates. During that same era, when American-born Black women and West Indian Black women both worked in New York City's garment district, the latter were, in quotes, more frequently found at the skilled tasks, end quote. More generally, the study found that the Black immigrant, in quotes, brings a cultural heritage that is vastly different from that of the American Negro, end quote. The first Black borough presidents of Manhattan were West Indians. Wow. As late as 1970, the highest ranking Blacks in New York's police department were West Indians, as were all the Black federal judges in this city. Shut the front door. The 1970 census showed that Black West Indian families in the New York metropolitan area had 28% higher incomes than the families of American Blacks. The incomes of second-generation West Indian families living in the same area exceeded that of Black families by 58%. Neither race nor racism can explain such differences, nor can slavery, since native-born Blacks and West Indian Blacks both had a history of slavery. Studies published in 2004 indicated that an absolute majority of the Black alumni of Harvard, okay, were either West Indian or African immigrants, or the children of these immigrants. Somewhat similar findings have emerged in studies of some other elite colleges. With Blacks as with whites, the redneck culture has been a less achieving culture. Moreover, that culture has affected a higher proportion of the Black population than of the white population, since only about 1/3 of all whites lived in the antebellum South, while 9/10 of all Blacks did. From the 1960s onward, most of the transplanted Southern culture would, like Black, quote-unquote, Black English, be seen as sacrosanct features of a distinctive Black, quote-unquote, identity, despite their mirroring very similar cultural patterns among Southern whites in times past. Not all Black Americans, of course, retained, this anachronistic culture for the spread of education and the growing experience of the counterproductive effects of the Southern redneck way of life eroded it over time for many Blacks, as happened also among the whites who brought this culture over from Britain. Even during the era of slavery, those Blacks who were house servants in more educated homes tended to pick up a different culture, giving their descendants enduring advantages over the descendants of field hands. Contemporary Black ghetto culture in the United States is not, however, a simple linear extrapolation from the culture of Southern whites. What was it saying? Hang on just a second. Education, growing experience, counterproductive effects of the Southern redneck way of life eroded it over time for many Blacks. This happened also among whites who brought this culture over from, even during the era of slavery, those Blacks who were house servants in more educated homes tended to pick up a different culture, giving their descendants enduring advantages over the descendants of, oh wow, huh, I knew I'd missed something there. Contemporary Black ghetto culture in the United States is not, however, a simple linear extrapolation from the culture of Southern whites. First of all, most Black Americans today are no longer part of ghetto culture. Moreover, aside from that, but you know what? The ones that get on the TV, they're part of it, the ghetto culture. Seriously. Moreover, aside from the influences peculiar to the circumstances, because they push a narrative, that's why they're on the TV. It's kind of like when they are interviewing, the whole stereotype about interviewing somebody after a storm, and it's somebody who's usually missing teeth and they have a wife beater on, and so I guess it's the same thing. I don't know. Moreover, aside from the influences peculiar to the circumstances of Blacks, profound changes in the larger American society around them have also had an influence, both positive and negative. The burgeoning of the American welfare state in the second half of the 20th century and the declining effectiveness of the American criminal justice system at the same time allowed borrowed and counterproductive culture traits to continue and flourish among these Blacks who had not yet moved beyond that culture, thereby prolonging the life of the chaotic, counterproductive, dangerous, and self-destructive subculture in many urban ghettos. Crime and violence were among the features of this subculture that were artificially prolonged prior to the 1960s. While black males had a higher murder rate than other males, their murder rate was also declining more sharply than the general murder rate. Subsequently, the general murder rate in the United States and the murder rate for the black males both reversed and began rising sharply, that of black males more sharply than others. In short, the drastic changes in law enforcement and social morality during the 1960s had particularly adverse effects on the behavior and actions of blacks and on black victims of the criminals in their midst. Intellectuals have also played a role, along with the welfare state, in prolonging and legitimatizing a counterproductive culture among blacks. Nowhere was the effect of the white liberalism of the 1960s on the social evolution of black culture more devastating than in the disintegration of the black family. Bring it. The raw facts are these. As of 1960, 51% of black females between the ages of 15 and 44 were married and living with their husbands. Another 20% were divorced, widowed, or separated, and only 28% had never been married. 20 years later, only 31% of black women in these age brackets were married and living with their husbands, while 48% had never been married, or had never married, by same difference. By 1944, an absolute majority, 56% of black women in these age brackets were never married, and only 25% were married and living with their husbands. Accordingly, while 2/3 of black children were living with both parents in 1960, only 1/3 were by 1994, while only 22% of black children were born to unmarried women in 1960, 70% were by 1994. I wonder if he's going to touch on anything about how they say, oh, well, the reason why that is because people were staying with people who were beating them and whatever else and stuff. And they just liberated themselves from them and everything. I'm going to tell you, it cannot be that high numbers like that, where people were being taken advantage of and all that kind of stuff. White liberals, instead of comparing what has happened to the black family since the liberal welfare state policies of the 1960s, were put into practice, compare black families to white families, and conclude that the higher rates of broken homes and unwed motherhood among blacks are due to, quote unquote, a legacy of slavery. But why the large-scale disintegration of the black family should have begun 100 years after slavery is left unexplained. Weird, right? Whatever the situation of the black family relative to the white family in the past or the present, it is clear that the broken homes were far more common among blacks at the end of the 20th century than they were in the middle of the century or at the beginning of that century. Even though blacks at the beginning of the 20th century were just one generation out of slavery, the widespread and casual abandonment of their children and of the women who bore them by black fathers in the ghettos of the late 20th century was in fact a painfully ironic contrast with what had happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery 100 years earlier, when observers of the South reported desperate efforts of freed blacks to find family members who had been separated from them during the era of slavery. A contemporary journalist reported meeting black men walking along the roads of Virginia and North Carolina, many of whom had walked across the state or across more than one state looking for their families. Others reported similar strenuous and even desperate efforts and newly freed blacks to find members of their families. New England enclaves. That's why I always say, like, ancestors be freaking rolling over in their graves, looking at what everybody's doing right now. New England enclaves. It should be noted again that not all blacks today are part of the redneck culture, far from it. Nor has that culture been the only culture in which blacks lived in the past. There were small but significant enclaves of New England culture introduced into Southern black communities by teachers from New England who poured into the South immediately after the end of the Civil War to establish schools and to teach and acculturate the children of freed slaves. Often these were the only schools available for black children. Because the South was slow to begin establishing public schools, especially for blacks, W.B. Du Bois called the work of these dedicated missionaries, quote unquote, the finest thing in American history. By 1866, and that's end quote. By 1866, just 1 year after Civil War ended, there were about 1,400 northern white teachers from dozens of religious missionary associations teaching black children in 975 southern schools. I don't know about you, but I've always heard that they didn't want blacks to learn anything. They didn't want them to learn nothing. You know what I mean? It's not true. Okie dokie. The numbers suggesting that these were mostly the kinds of one-room schoolhouses common at the time in rural areas, which is where most Southern blacks lived. Just a few years later, at the end of the decade, there were more than 2,500 Northern teachers and just over 2,000 schools for black children. A sample of about 1,000 of these teachers, whose origins could be traced, showed that more than 500 came directly from New England, and the others are believed to include people born in New England but who came south directly for some other location. To put this in perspective, only 17% of the northern population lived in New England at the time. So this was a wholly disproportionate representation of New Englanders among those who began to educate newly emancipated blacks. This was a New England-led crusade, much like the pre-war abolitionist movement, and many of those who went into the post-bellum South were former abolitionists. These teachers brought a wholly different culture into the South. In the words of distinguished black scholar E. Franklin Franzier, Franzier, in quotes, the missionaries from New England who founded the first schools for Negroes in the South left the imprint of their Puritan background upon Negro education, end quote. In addition to strict morality, these missionaries, in quotes, taught the Yankee virtues of industry and thrift, end quote. This cultural transformation was not incidental. The avowed purpose of the American Missionary Association was to transplant a different culture into the school and college enclaves, which they established among young blacks in the South in order to deliberately supplant the existing culture. These were deeply religious institutions, but in the New England sense, so that black students, in quotes, were not to indulge in the religious emotionalism of the black masses, end quote. In the South, they were to be different in many other ways, as E. Franklin Franzier noted. First, students were taught to speak English correctly, and thus avoid the ungrammatical speech and dialect of the Negro masses. They were expected to be courteous, speak softly, and never exhibit the spontaneous boisterousness of ordinary Negroes. The casual Southern attitude towards sex was not tolerated, end quotes. To be detected in immoral sex behavior, especially if the guilty person was a woman, meant expulsion from the school, end quote. The American Missionary Association was quite explicit in their desire to remove black youngsters from their existing culture and place them in enclaves of the cultures transplanted from the North. I'm going to tell you something else I heard a whole bunch growing up was that they didn't like, they wanted to suppress our culture this, our culture that. They don't want us to show our culture. I mean, the heathenistic culture, because that's not cool. Not even over there where it came from the white folks, right? It literally was not cool then, and their own people shunned them, right? Because they didn't want them pouring their toilet bowl, their honey pot, out in the street. They didn't want them parading around killing folks because somebody looked at them funny, right? They're talking about the white men doing that here to blacks and stuff, but literally the whites was doing it to the whites over there, right? Like, come on now. And they just took that culture and ran with it. And an 1882 essay titled, so let's suppress that culture, right? It's like barbaric. We're civilized. Anyway, in an 1882 essay titled, quote unquote, Change of Environment, Dr. W.W. Patton, president of the AMA, lamented that many black children, in quotes, grow up in communities of prevalent ignorance, superstition, and immorality, where they live in miserable hovels, see only examples of coarseness and rudeness, and hear only a Negro dialect, end quote, when what was needed was, in quote, a total change of environment, end quote, by removing young people to places, in quotes, where morals are pure, where manners are refined, where language is grammatical, end quote. Don't go hang, till we meet again. Love you, mean it.